Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cadlow, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen.
Welcome to Strength Chat with your host, the mad scientist of strength. Well, myself, Chris Duffin. To my right, we've got our master athlete and coach, Dr. Rudolph. And to my left, I forgot his name. What's your name?
The man.
The man? Okay.
The man.
We've got the man.
We've been joined by the man, Dr.
The wizard of training, Brandon Sen. And today, we're excited to have Dr. Mario Novo. Did I get your name, the last name correct on there, Mario?
Right on.
Oh, yes. I finally got one. I
Nailed it,
love
man. You got
butchering.
an easy one.
I love butchering everybody's names, and I didn't even prep in advance.
Didn't
No
even
practice.
try.
No practice. But Dr. Mario,
Just two syllables. You got it.
It was an easy one, but I'll take it whenever I can get it.
Still working on Guido Van Rice again.
So Dr. Mario is with Owens Recovery, and they do a bunch of work with blood flow restriction and training a lot of clinics, pro teams, all sorts of stuff. And this is using the clinical-based stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a minute, but there's quite a bit difference between what they're doing and what you see being practiced and called blood flow restriction in a lot of gyms. So we'll get into that. But first, I'd like to get a little bit of background, about yourself and how you got into where you're at right now.
So I'm a clinical physical therapist. I early on sat between the world of research and clinical PT. Ever since moving out here to Tennessee from Miami, Florida, it's been a bit of a shift. So I kind of dug in deep and, as they say, got into the trenches with PT, training a wide spread of patients all the way from 8-year-olds all the way up to 80-year-olds. And it's an interesting, obviously, profession to get involved in because in general, when we're talking about things like, strength and power and hypertrophy, these are terms that we apply to an overwhelming, very straightforward statement of, quality of life, longevity. Your ability to obviously be a badass with a barbell is one thing, but, is that sustainable? Can it carry over? How do we facilitate that knowledge to make a lifter for life and not just, a 1 or 2 year person who gets into it and then kind of breaks themselves apart and gets out.
Yep, that's pretty much our philosophy, as you're well aware. We actually met each other. I would say met, but over Instagram and videos, and so Dr. Mario is a little bit familiar with our "Living Better Through Strength" motto, and that's how we connected. Yep. Is similar sort of themes with our thought processes and how we approach it. So continue on.
Sure. So throughout the course of me being involved in also teaching at an academic level. I teach at local universities here. One of my mentors long ago, his name is Dennis Brunt. He told me, he goes, Mario, you're destined to always go back into the world of research. You're destined to teach people. You have that unique quality about you, but you need to figure out a problem because in reality, getting passionate about what you do is really going to require you. And I'm going to take this coin. I forget who exactly said this. But it's digging an inch wide and a mile deep. You need to plug away at that one thing that's going to drive you every morning to get up and get shit done. And for me, since I worked with so many people varying in age, the one thing I kept seeing was an underprescription, an underdosage of what they actually need to do to get a training effect. Coming from a background in strength and conditioning, first being an exercise physiologist, I knew what I needed to do. And I knew that the PT arena was a ripe environment. And we kind of see this happening a lot across the board. Lots of PTs are now going hybrid, moving away from this this antiquated model, this 3 sets of 10 DeLorme model with a yellow band, and actually, getting some real weight, some load being placed on this individual and just challenging them, challenging the system. People by no means are frail. I think oftentimes the thought of how muscles and how bones and our ligaments and our tendons work. A lot of people really don't pay much appreciation to the simple fact that, walking, running, or hopping, these are loads that place oftentimes 2 to 4 times body weight on your structure. So by no means are we frail, but unfortunately,
we're pretty resilient, and it's a point we hit on often in our podcasts and discussions. Is like, this is a basic human thing to adapt and have change. You've got to have a stress, and too often we see exactly what you're talking about: under prescribed, approach, load, whatever you want to call it, and you're not providing that stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Now, sitting in the world of rehab, this is where my introduction to BFR came in from. So, looking at the emerging science that was coming out in terms of low load resistance training, because this is oftentimes what's used, preliminarily when somebody is, acutely injured. I'm not going to be, and when I say acutely injured, I mean this is an individual who has gone beyond overreaching, beyond overtraining, and now has gone to a point where, we have actually disrupted tissue and we have created a pain experience. Now the individual is, unable to fully achieve a muscle contraction without pain. This is in large part because muscle contractions, your ability to facilitate muscle contraction is very much inversely proportional to your pain threshold. So, if my pain thresholds are way up, it means it takes a lot of info to get me to hurt. I'm obviously going to be able to contract a good amount of through my musculoskeletal system. The opposite would be true. So, sitting on that fence of saying, I know how people need to train, but at the same go, I know that we need to let this system kind of cool down. We need to let the inflammation process do its job. We need to let the immune system get in there, start regenerating tissue. But at the same go, we need to be able to have something that allows us to bridge the gap between initial injury, immobilization, and then PT. Something's got to come in there, because what we find oftentimes is that even with healthy individuals, 2 weeks of immobilization is enough to shut off, strength by up to 47%. In some schools, they'll even say up to maybe 49, 50%. In 2 weeks of immobilization, again, on healthy individuals, you can see losses of muscle mass up to 350 grams. That was studies taken of the quad, looking at the cross-sectional area. The crazy thing is, a surrogate measure for that is the weight of your heart. So literally within 2 weeks of not moving, you're losing that much in terms of functional strength, and then obviously all the other things that come with it, right? Your independence, how you critically appraise yourself, the psychological toll on the individual. So in wanting to find something better and wanting to find something that would essentially shift the paradigm, right, or the paradigm shift for PT, I came across information on blood flow restriction. And very rapidly did I go down a little rabbit hole of getting to be introduced to Johnny Owens. So he's the founder of Owens Recovery Science. And I was probably, I'd say, pretty annoying at first. Lots of messages, lots of phone calls, had a ton of questions to ask him, and started just getting into, heavy into the literature myself. There's a ton of great stuff that already exists within the healthy population, looking at blood flow restriction. And I was interested to find how I could use this for my patients in the rehab setting. And bridging from there, how can this be used in the performance setting? Meaning, if I've got somebody who is not an injured athlete, but is in a very heavy training program right now, where I need to improve their overall, let's say, if it was somebody who needed to improve their 1 minute, mile run, somebody who needed to improve their vertical jump height, somebody who needed to just put more weight on the bar, but not incur further overreaching or overtraining, what could be a tool I could also use for them? Again, that's where a lot of the studies pointed me towards BFR. And eventually now it's literally become part of my overall business. I have my own private practice, which is Lifters Clinic. That's the handle that I use to contact you. And I do educational work for Owens Recovery Science, aside from my swath of other things that I do, which is teaching at a higher education level within a sports medicine program. And as well, soon to be, might be getting some pro team fun going on here with some research with them. So we'll see where that goes. But
so
that's
you
my
guys,
background.
Yeah, you guys have done quite a bit work. Can you talk about the clinics that you do and the certifications and who you've worked with? Kind of in that regard, give us some context of the breadth of scope.
Sure. So BFR, as we know it now in the clinical field, using a specialized computer-controlled tourniquet system, started off in the DoD. So for any servicemen and women who have ever had to face a pretty severe and traumatic injury, a lot of times leading to them being admitted to what we call the limb salvage unit, they would go to San Antonio, Texas. It's where they have a center called CFI. It stands for Center for the Intrepid. And that's actually where Johnny Owens was the original, I believe he was the chief executive officer there and rehab director. And his role was basically to figure out a way to get these people either back to active duty or to get them to not cut their legs off. Because a lot of times you'd find these servicemen and women would be, looking at the other guy who got his leg blown off by an IED and going, well, fuck, I'm sitting here, I got my leg still, but it doesn't work. I want to be like that guy. Can I just cut my leg off? And in many instances, John even has some stories of some wild stuff, man. Some people putting their legs in dry ice just to burn and damage their legs enough that the surgeons would have no other choice but to remove them so they can advance to the prosthetic leg. So they really were scratching their heads with what can we do to get these guys better? How can we get them fitted in these specialized orthotic devices that they were creating or robotic units that they were creating? And they came across some literature on BFR. Rapidly, the DoD developed it into their overall treatment protocol. And, they started noticing that, hey, man, this BFR unit that we're working on, this guy here who, had a volumetric loss injury. He took an RPG to his leg, or he took some heavy shrapnel. This guy right next to him, that's an ACL patient. I bet you this would work well for that ACL guy. And slowly but surely, it started to adapt itself to more orthopedic conditions. And as word got out, pro teams started to come in. And they were really interested in wanting to find out how best we can get players back onto the field faster, but better, right? And we'll talk in detail about what better actually means in terms of, how can occluding blood flow lead to tissue regeneration. It's pretty remarkable stuff that's happening, tapping into our own physiology. But obviously in the beginning, there was a lot of non-disclosure forms, and we really couldn't go out and publicly say who we were working with and what was happening. And those things have now progressed where anybody here listening to the podcast can check us out at owensrecoveryscience.com. Go to the certified providers tab, and you'll see all the pro teams we're working with. So we're pretty heavily invested into all the pro NFL teams. I think it was about maybe 4 weeks ago, we were signing on with Cubbies. So MLB's coming on strong after this last winter seminars with the athletic training group. We were at PBATS. We'll be doing the NSCA conference coming up soon. I believe Zach Long is going to be kind of spearheading that one with Barbell Physio. And, it's grown. We've got NBA teams on board. ESPN has now done 4 segments on us. And, again, it's just continuing to merge itself into something bigger from the rehab community. But the cool thing is a lot of these sports teams, these guys are now catching on with the performance side of things. Meaning, a good example is Dwight Howard. He missed, I think it was a total of some, I don't want to get this wrong and Dwight be listening. You never know. Let's just say he missed a lot of games, more so than needed to be. And it was because of a chondral defect in his knees. You're talking about, on average, these guys are running 5 to 7 miles on a given game on hardwood floors. That's not forgiving. And they tried all types of training with this guy. And they put him underneath occlusion. It helped to reduce the load on his joints, but get the same training effect as heavy weight training. And the guy, I think, only had to miss 1 or 2 games the following season, but because he was sick, it had nothing to do with his knee pain. And we've been seeing that time and time again occur. So it's not something that's, again, just being used for rehab, but for the performance end of things. And Now's where the difficult part comes in. Getting this out to everybody. BFR is not Go ahead.
I was going to say, getting it out to everybody. It sounds like it's already, out there. I don't even know why I'd need to see you, Mario. I mean, I read a quick clickbait article. I could slap a band on my arm and get to it. So, what's really the difference there?
So, in general, we'll roll into it. So, BFR is essentially a type of training that allows an individual in some circles, right, to use a cuff, to use a wrap placed around a limb, pretty proximal on the hip or on the arm. And it will essentially cut off all venous flow out of the limb, and it allows continued arterial flow into the limb. And that's the key right there, is the continued arterial flow into the limb. It's very difficult to assess that if I'm simply using a knee wrap, which is what a lot of these companies promote, which is just wrapping up a limb and using a compression scale. We call this practical blood flow restriction. But the reality is that, getting a clot, no one cares about that. Surgeons don't even care about that. Why? Because they'll typically put you underneath a tourniquet at about 110% occlusion for 6 hours. They don't care. Your limb's not going to die because of that. And we're doing it for 5 minutes. But what they are concerned about is nerve damage. And that's the real big issue here. If I'm using a knee wrap and wrapping my leg or wrapping my partner, there's a big difference between wrapping a joint, like wrapping in a knee, or wrapping an elbow before you go and lift, where you actually have the joint itself protecting the nerve structures as they move in and around the bone, versus if I'm putting it over the mid part of a long bone. Now I run the risk of demyelinating a nerve. Severe compression to a nerve can be permanent damage. So, if you're doing this because you're trying to get the max benefit out of it, then that means frequency, like anything. If your training stops today, you stop adapting. So you've got to be able to do things in an intelligent way that allow you to continue to keep progressing forward. So for me, the knee wrap is just, I'm basically just guessing the whole entire time. There's nothing there that's standardizing my understanding of what I'm doing to my hemodynamics. That means my blood flow. And especially if I'm applying this to somebody else. So like if there's trainers out there listening to this, obviously if you want to do something to yourself, by all means do whatever you want to yourself. We're all guinea pigs in our own little lab. But if you're going to be doing this to somebody else and you're making the claim of all these positive effects of BFR, you got to go and look at the literature and you got to respect some of the risks involved, like with anything. So you can pick up a cuff if you wanted to, even pneumatic cuffs like blood pressure cuffs. But again, it's very hard to determine what the blood flow in and out of the limb is, and that's where, again, you run that risk of nerve damage and or just overshooting it. There's lots of literature, especially stuff from Lactic, that demonstrate, if you overshoot, you run the risk of nerve damage. If you undershoot, you run the risk of not getting the actual whole blood lactate effect you're going for. So again, if you're using low weight, don't waste your time if you're not doing it with the right conditions. Meaning if I'm like, all right, I'm purposely using low intensity weight to get these training effects, but I'm not doing it with any sort of gold standard measure, then don't do that if you're not hurt. Don't do that if you're not trying to recover from one session to another. Just take the day off, If you're really trying to maximize the benefits, you got to do it right. And by doing it right, you got to have at least some sort of information from something coming to you. So
let's talk about the literature a little bit. You mentioned you got started by researching the literature, but can you talk about who the pioneers were and, what was the hypothesis? How did they decide that restricting blood flow to a limb would be a good idea?
So going back, looking at some of the work originally from Sato, he's one of the developers of the Katsu system. He was really interested in finding ways to extrapolate some of the information that he was finding about tourniquets. So there's a breadth of information out there that starts looking at applying tourniquets to individuals who had spinal cord injuries to reduce atrophy in that limb, although the limb was denervated. Finding ways to as well decrease atrophy in immobilized individuals, and looking at the effects of tourniquet placement reducing clots. So that's kind of really where a lot of this information started from. Sato said, hey, the education out there on clot formation and tourniquets doesn't show that. We can use it. It's safe. The information out there on reducing muscle atrophy, for some reason, tourniquets do that, but we didn't really know why. It wasn't until later on that there was really a kind of breakthrough moment where this realization of, well, I can't lift heavy weights with this tourniquet on, but for some reason it's creating this massive pump when I just do lightweight work, and there's really no pain with it. That started to branch off into more of an understanding that using a tourniquet and occluding blood flow would allow certain key growth factors to essentially say, the best example I can give for this is when the original studies were being done, they were simply comparing, looking at blood flow restriction or simply putting a tourniquet on and doing nothing with it. Again, that's where they saw there was a decreased effects of atrophy on the limb that did nothing with it. When they started to include some light intensity exercises into using the cuff or underneath occlusion, they started noticing obvious changes occurring in the muscle tissue, which they kind of looked at saying, well, hey, maybe this is associated with some increases in IGF, because that was the number one things that they were seeing originally was, with increases in lactate, they saw increases in IGF-1, they saw increases in growth hormone. But there was still very little understanding about why muscles were adapting the way that they were adapting. And the information from Japan then kind of spread out. They said, well, maybe this is a good exercise for older people, because we're seeing that, muscles are getting stronger, muscles are getting bigger. They still didn't know why, but they started to look down into understanding, does this play a role maybe with helping people to essentially, like, could we use this with groups that can't really lift heavy to begin with? Lots of walking studies were done in the early 2000s. Lots of cycling studies were done in the early 2000s. They were monitoring things like I mentioned before, whole blood lactate, monitoring as well effects of creatine kinase or D-dimer. These are kind of examples of pro-inflammatory markers or tissue breakdown. And what they were noticing was that the risk was very low, or to no risk. They weren't seeing any issues with DVT. They were seeing that these people were becoming more functional. And the education at that point just kept kind of branching further on up to look at other types of activities. But it originally, spawned out of Japan. If I can give you some more information on it, there had been some views in looking at things called like hypoxic training, where they use actual hypoxic chambers to lower oxygen. And another thing they started noticing was that, within these hypoxic chambers, same thing, cellular metabolism would slow down, muscle breakdown would slow down, muscle protein breakdown specifically, would slow down. And it was from there that this kind of push towards seeing what would happen with any sort of physical work while you use a tourniquet kind of branched off from. If I can go into, because the stuff that they did with the Katsu training system originally was a very static and isolated held system, meaning they were kind of picking and choosing random occlusion pressures and trying to see, what occlusion pressures would be best to use, what could we standardize to use with people. And it's the numbers were kind of all over the board. And that's kind of where some issues came with was, guesstimating on the limb occlusion pressure sometimes would lead to pain. There's no cases of reported DVT using it.
For our listeners aren't familiar, that's deep vein thrombosis.
Deep vein thrombosis. This would be a clot that forms in a vein. That is very dangerous because the clot can move to your lungs and it could essentially drown you or
you don't want DVT.
You don't want a DVT, no. So the information from that point, looking at the early studies that Sato did, just putting a compression cuff on, looking at walking, looking at cycling, low load exercises, really started to gain the interest of a lot of muscle physiologists. And they wanted to learn more about, why are muscles responding this way? Why are people improving in their walking distance? Why are people improving in their time to fatigue? Functional measures, a timed up and go, a 1RM. And from there is when they started realizing that to kind of give you an example, all muscles act like tourniquets. So when you contract a muscle, it essentially tourniquets the deep arteries of the body, and it pushes also on the superficial veins. And if we do this continuously, your muscles will switch out to a subset of muscle fibers that promote the byproduct of lactic acid. So, like, to give you an example, right now we're all sitting talking. We're using these slow twitch muscle fibers that use oxygen dependently as energy, and sugar. Their byproduct is predominantly like carbolic acid or CO2, what we breathe out. We only use the fast twitch muscle fibers when the demand and the task is high enough. And it's because of these type 2 muscle fibers that we see increases in hypertrophy and in strength, endurance, and in power. But it has a lot more to do with the metabolic state of what's happening to the muscle than the mechanical state. So as muscle physiologists got more and more interested as to understanding, why is placing a tourniquet on somebody just alone decreasing atrophy? And then when you promote low intensity exercise, how is that actually gaining any of these functional measures? They started to uncover how lactate and the metabolic stress that it places on a muscle is the direct trigger for stimulating a lot of these effects that we see with high intensity training. So sometime around the mid-2000s, there was more of a push for understanding how mTORC, or mammalian target of rapamycin 1, played a role with protein synthesis. So to kind of make this easy for the listeners, every point of the day, your body is either at a protein breakdown state or a protein building state. When we lift weights, the stimulus of lifting weights can create tissue breakdown. It can also promote lactic acid. And when we activate these pathways, they will initially stimulate growth hormone to be released. And originally we thought growth hormone had a lot to do with muscle hypertrophy. In fact, it has a lot more to do with the ultrastructure of muscle. It means it just makes muscle stronger. It keeps it better intact. It does the same with ligaments, tendons, and bone, which is what's really interesting about weight training in general, is weight training makes you more resilient, makes you stronger to withstand any sort of load you place on your body. So, in further understanding what was happening with let me stay on the same page here. Sorry if I get off topic. So when your muscles contract, they act as tourniquets. You do work long enough, you run out of oxygen, you switch over to these type 2 muscle fibers. They make lactic acid. The lactic acid makes growth hormone. The growth hormone makes collagen. Collagen is that stuff that we need to improve all of our ultrastructure of tissues, but it does some other cool stuff too. It activates IGF-1. And we used to think IGF-1 was predominantly associated with muscle hypertrophy, but we know it has a lot more to do actually with the muscle's ability to recover. Mm-hmm. Each muscle cell, essentially, the more muscle cells you have, the faster you can recover. We're kind of genetically limited to a degree by how many muscle myocytes or muscle cells we have. But if you work hard enough, you lift hard enough, create enough damage, your body will plant more muscle cells in the muscle. It does this via satellite cells. And we used to think you only needed mechanical damage to do that. But it turns out that lactic acid, all on its own, can do it. And so as our muscles work, we get out of that slow twitch world, the Krebs cycle, we go into the fast twitch world. We see all these positive effects happening that we used to think were solely based off of weight. But what we're beginning to discover is it's not just weight. It's also the metabolic stress that we place on the muscle. It's that lactic acid. And this is where, muscle physiologists got really interested on looking at BFR because of its effects of rapidly increasing lactic acid well beyond baseline levels with low weight. And also, when using lightweight, making lactic acid levels reach as high, if not even higher, than when using high intensity weight, because obviously you have to take a break at some point and that lactic acid clears. So I know that was a long answer.
That was a good answer, though. But
go ahead.
I guess the question, though, now is, like, what does that look like? So, essentially we're stimulating that same process on a cellular level, right? That is happening from the weight training, but we're taking out the having to, lift heavy weights to accomplish that.
Correct.
But, what does that look like when you put it into place for those different types of applications? Let's say, rehab or strength training for hypertrophy, or, it sounded like there's some endurance benefits. Like, what does that look like from like a training perspective when you put this into place?
So, in general, if we were to say we follow what the American College of Sports Medicine provides us, with the most basic information, we know that in order to promote muscle hypertrophy, we need to be lifting at 75 to 85% of our 1RM. We know that as strength goals are trying to be met, that weight obviously has to increase. And then obviously power is a little different. It just depends on how you're programming your power for your athletes, but it doesn't always have to be very, very heavy, like 90%. It could be a little lower if we're looking for explosive work. Well, amongst all that training, we have to recover. And recovery sometimes can mean taking days off, where we focus on nutrition, because we know the nutrition plays a big role with improving protein synthesis, right, keeping us on the positive end of things. But in some instances, overreaching can occur, and then that leads to more downtime. BFR in that scenario can easily be fit into somebody's training protocol where we're going to strategically place it on off days. And the reason why off days is because there's not enough evidence yet to support using it the day of training, meaning like if I did some heavy lifting and then I did BFR afterwards, there's not a lot of evidence yet to show that. Anecdotally, we're seeing that people are not having any sort of negative effects of using BFR after they actually do heavy weight training. A lot of that simply has to do with the fact that lifting lighter loads doesn't create mechanical damage. And this is kind of one of the hallmarks of BFR, is that with continued work, even up to 3 times a day, individuals are showing no more muscle tissue breakdown than their matched controls, which are using the same light weight, which is awesome, because that means that we're promoting more of this hypertrophic neuromuscular benefits without taxing the recovery system. Meaning I can lift heavy weights and create some muscle damage and then do some BFR and not add any more damage to it. But generally, I prescribe it with athletes that I'm working with. I'll usually do it the day after. So say, for example, we did a heavy leg day. The day after, we may use BFR to just ride a bike. We have a 15-minute session. And believe me, it's a tough-ass 15 minutes that you're doing. But you're not incurring any more tissue breakdown in that one session. You're, in fact, really upregulating the protein synthesis pathways and really doing a good justice of not only rebuilding muscle, but remember, you're stimulating growth hormone. You're stimulating collagen synthesis. You're decreasing scar tissue formation. That's another thing that happens with heavy lactic acid. And at the same goal, you're also stimulating vascular endothelial growth factor, which is what improves the endurance. So in that kind of scenario, that's how that would look. Let's say that individual did get hurt. Well, they're going to be on some downtime. Maybe they need to recover. They can use BFR methods to allow them in that recovery state to not lose any ground. And a good example is, let's say, like an endurance runner. They can't go out and run. They're rehabbing. Well, rather than put them on a bike and have them do 15 or 20 minutes of steady state cardio or submax work, I can put them under BFR and have them get the same training effects as if they were at like an 80% VO2 training session, when they're actually just at like a 40 or 45% VO2 training session. So they can recover while not losing any of those gains. Let's say on the strength and power end of things, which is what you guys are probably interested on. Let's say that I tore my pec. Let's say it wasn't a grade 3. Let's say it was maybe a grade 1 muscle strain. Happens a lot to guys because they don't prep their skin enough, right? I.e. pain pill. right? They're not doing enough soft tissue work. They're not taking care of their body. So I can put them underneath occlusion and have them do some work, obviously, for the arm. But interesting thing with BFR is we're actually seeing changes occur proximally, too.
Okay, that was one of my questions, is like, how do you attack glutes, lats, pecs, that sort of area?
Yeah, so that question comes up a lot because intuitively you go, okay, the cuffs on my arm, so everything below the arm is getting shut off from oxygen, so I get it. But above the cuff, it gets a little interesting. And so the answer I can give you is there's not 100% clear reason why we're seeing the changes, but the changes are happening. So in studies looking at bench press and squat, we're observing that increases in pec size, in 1RM strength, these are in healthy individuals, as well in glute size and glute strength and power output, like on an isokinetic device. They're all improving, but the loads are very light. And when compared to match controls, we're actually seeing that the match controls are losing strength because they're not having to fire these fast twitch muscle fibers for the next 3 or 6 weeks, which is what the studies have done. So some of the theories behind why it's happening. So the first one is called the central fatigue theory. So I'll kind of run your listeners through an easy setup here. Let's say, for example, I'm pushing a rock up a hill. At some point, continuing to push that rock up the hill is going to exhaust my legs of oxygen because, remember, my muscles act like a tourniquet. When that happens, certain nerve fibers in your muscle tell your brain you need to get your shit together and you need to fire more muscle down below. We need to recruit some other groups. So we say that there's an increased recruitment of the alpha motor neuron. And as that neuron starts to fire more muscles get called into question. So now I'm not just pushing this rock up the hill with my legs. Now I'm pushing it with my back. My shoulders are getting involved. My neck, I'm grinding my teeth. My jaw is getting involved. And the effect of fatigue has a wide effect on increasing muscle recruitment up the kinetic chain. And this is part of what we call the central fatigue theory. As certain muscles fatigue, other muscles have to kick in to complete the job. And this is an innate built-in mechanism of our nervous system. We don't have much control of it. You know, if you got to get the job done, your body's going to figure out the way to get the job done, regardless if it's the path of least resistance. Most of the time, it's just the path of resistance, and it's just going to attempt to get it done. So in the effects of why does the glutes get bigger, why does the pec get bigger? Because your leg muscles get weaker. They get tired. They get fatigued. I don't want to say weaker. That's the wrong term. They get fatigued. So say, for example, while I'm doing a bench press, you know, your triceps are going to be fried well before you're done. So what happens? Well, muscles only pull. So although it looks like I'm pushing the weight, I'm actually pulling the weight. So as my tricep pulls and my pec pulls in, well, my pec has to now pull faster because the tricep can't do the job. So the pec recruitment goes up, and as the pec recruitment goes up, what happens? Type 2 motor units kick in, the pec produces lactic acid, and here's where the second theory comes in, which is called backflow. So backflow theory states that certain muscles have kind of a drainage into the limb to help with some of the pressures that get built up in them while they're lifting or while you're just moving around in general. So some of the backflow allows the pec to start building up with lactic acid, because it can't drain some of it out into the arm, and the same would be true in the leg. Although the glute does have its own blood supply and its own way of managing that, there are other muscles in your ass. You've got your whole hip rotator group. You also have your adductors and where they insert high up into the hip. So again, those are theories. They're still under testing, to see exactly if that's what's happening, but the results are present, and that's essentially the best example we have to provide us to why we're seeing them occur. So, again, an example, somebody with a pec tear, all right, let's go do some lightweight work. This isn't enough mechanical damage to further stress out your pec. We know we're not going to create any tissue breakdown because the weight is really low, but we're going to get all the benefits of it. The third theory, which is kind of like, it's an interesting one, and there's some studies showing some promising effects, is the effects of whole blood lactate. And this would also maybe lead to why that pec would get better in terms of regenerating tissue, improving collagen synthesis. So This was a study done in, I believe it was 2014. They were looking at using a group of BFR to do leg press, and then following the leg press, doing bicep curls. They had another group do leg press, no BFR, and then followed up with bicep curls. The bicep curls are about 50% of their 1RM. The leg press was at roughly about, I think, 30 to 35% of their 1RM. The group that did the leg press with a BFR, guess what happened to their biceps?
Got bigger.
They grew. Yeah, that was the weirdest thing ever. Didn't happen to the other group. So this was kind of one of these early findings looking at, man, does whole blood lactate have an effect on the body in a way that we weren't predicting? We're really starting to even understand further concepts of, muscle to bone interaction on how, for bones to heal, they require muscle specifically to contract over it, even if it's not in weight bearing. Just to contract over it is enough to stimulate those effects. And now we're starting to understand that, bones are littered with collagen receptor sites. So guess what happens when you train? You create lactic acid if you're training at a high enough training zone to get a training effect. That lactic acid promotes growth hormone, which gives you that collagen synthesis activation. And that's why we're even seeing in some early studies now improving bone healing effects.
This is just a side topic. I was reading some recent research as well that was just showing the benefits of basically pre-workout collagen ingestion, because you're providing that right before you have the stimulus for using that. So anyway, it just kind of feeds into that same discussion as actually taking some of those basically joint bone things support is your pre-training to support that process.
Well, what's interesting is that it's kind of funny because I think we've all heard this before at some point. Hey, when you're done training, you got this window, you got to get your protein in, you got to get that protein synthesis going. So you got to get that, as fast as possible. But we know that window doesn't really exist.
Yep.
And the reason being is because when you're finished training and your body has gone through you've beat it up a little bit, your muscles and your body does not give a crap about protein synthesis. That's really hard to do. That's a lot of energy it takes to make that happen. But what's the number one thing it's interested in doing? Collagen synthesis. That's why as soon as you're done training, what numbers go up? Growth hormone. And that's where we're really starting to fully understand the effects of how BFR really plays a role with training and performance and regeneration, because with repeated studies looking at growth hormone, on average, we're seeing at time of completion of just one round of BFR, which we can talk about, what that constitutes. We're seeing increases of up to 300% from baseline of growth hormone, which is insane.
That's
this is your body.
Yep.
Yeah, this is your body essentially going, holy shit, that 2-pound weight, that was a fucking T-Rex chasing me. I was literally, your brain has no idea, your pituitary gland has no idea what you've just done to it, other than it received a huge stimulus from lactic acid. And it said, okay, time to make growth hormone, time to get this process going. So that's kind of the biggest benefits we're seeing using it, even after heavy weight training. But again, there's not a lot of studies to promote that yet. But anecdotally, we're not seeing any negative effects, even with the clients that I train.
So just repeating kind of simplification of it then, BFR is allowing arterial blood flow into the limb, but occluding the venous flow out. So
Correct.
Would I conclude that by creating lactic acid in the restricted limb, because it can't get out, it stays in the muscle longer, therefore creating more benefit? It's creating HGH, and that sits there at a longer period of time. Is that oversimplification?
No, that's right on point. That's exactly what it's doing. And it's not just growth hormone; it's also hydrogen ions, or what we call just metabolites, just byproduct of muscle work. And it's not just letting it sit there longer; it's the fact that it actually keeps building and building and building. And this is kind of where, like, your initial question was, why can't I just put a knee wrapper on my leg? Well, you can put a knee wrapper on your leg and create the effects of BFR, but as you continue to keep working, liquid in your body acts as a space occupier. much like inflammation does. So if I'm getting a buildup of lactic acid and I continue to keep working, if I'm not having any sort of way to monitor how much pressure I have in the limb, I'm essentially pushing that stuff out. And I'm decreasing the effects of it. This is where I go, you can put a knee wrap on, but man, if you're healthy or you're using this to recover with light weight, learn a little bit more about what you're doing before you try to do it. Because if you're healthy, you're just wasting your damn time. And if you're trying to recover, again, you're wasting your damn time. And you can create some irreversible effects if you damage your nervous system doing that. And especially if you're a trainer who's listening or you're a clinician who's listening, you got to have the right tools to do the job like anything. So
and you guys offer certifications on doing this correctly, right?
Yeah. I mean, the certification course is geared towards getting you just understanding how to be successful with BFR with your clients. It involves knowing, getting a review of the literature, application throughout many different aspects. So, learning how to use it in a strength protocol, learning how to use it for an endurance protocol, and as well what we call a cell swelling protocol. And I think this is, to your question, what you were asking before about oversimplifying it. It's exactly on point what's happening, because the other effects that you're getting from being underneath the tourniquet are the effects of cellular swelling. So I recently wrote an article for John Meadows over at Mountain Dog Diet, and it was focused on just kind of outlining the effects of how muscles undergo hypertrophy. It's a good conversation. It's always good to have it again. Excellent stuff that's come out, obviously from Jacob Wilson over at ASPI, and as well from his name is eluding me right now, Schoenfield, who's done a lot of work in muscle hypertrophy. So understanding some of these triggers of mechanical damage, metabolic damage, cell swelling, these are critical to understand, because it allows you to further program what you're doing to gain the best benefit. And what we're seeing with BFR is that even in instances where individuals cannot undergo exercise, I'm talking about like a post-op, so now go into the area of rehab, which is where I focus a lot. Let's say I've got somebody who's post-op, they can't do any sort of weight training at all right now. They just had a tendon repaired. I can put a tourniquet on somebody and literally inflate it and deflate it for, let's say, 3 5-minute sessions. And just that alone is enough to stimulate muscle cells to release lactic acid. It's enough to change the fluid shift in the composition of muscle to drive more fluid into the muscle. That's what leads to the pump effect. And that's very beneficial, because cells also respond not only to lactic acid, but they respond to this pumping effect of hydration by undergoing protein synthesis. Essentially, they try to make themselves more resilient to the stress of being kind of stretched apart. But we also see positive effects of, here's a good example to give your followers. When you strength train, you break apart tissue, right? We all can agree that happens. Mm-hmm. Why don't all of us walk out of the gym all scarred up? Why aren't we walking out with, fibrotic muscles because we're breaking apart tissue? Because last I checked, when you tear something, it scars, right? But why, when we weight train, it doesn't scar the same way or scar at all? The key is lactic acid. So when lactic acid gets released, it shuts down a pathway that's called TGF-beta. And TGF-beta is the promoting pathway for scar tissue formation. Another thing that happens is, when you get injured, your body upregulates the muscle building blocking pathway called myostatin. And if you guys are familiar with myostatin, some of us have a little bit more myostatin than others. That means for some of it's a little harder to put on muscle mass. What shuts down myostatin? Lactic acid. So there's a lot of direct benefit that simply the lactic acid is doing on its own. That the low oxygen increasing the nervous system firing, that's what increases the strength. And then as well, the cell swelling effect. So it's kind of like we're getting all the benefits of heavy weight training without the mechanical damage. We simply remove it from the equation.
You know,
Which
that's a great place maybe to sum things
Hold
up here.
on.
I was going to say we got it. Brandon's got to have one
Brandon's-
question.
This whole conversation, Jesus Christ, is blowing my mind. I haven't even talked the whole time. So
I was actually waiting for a question to come from you, man.
no, I'm just, I don't know, man. The most interesting thing that you mentioned was, some of the total body effects of BFR, because it's very common for people to isolate a bicep, a tricep, a hamstring, a quad. It's not as intuitive to understand the transient effects through the pecs, lats, maybe glutes. So that was super interesting to me. One thing that we are definitely running up on time, and I'll probably get yelled at for going over, but I really want to get into some, if you can, specific protocols to people follow. So I know there's a wide variety, and it's totally dependent on individual application, but a lot of the things that are preached throughout, and there's a few people within the industry who are promoting BFR, and it seems like the most common prescription for it, that I've observed, is going one set to failure at like 20 to 30% of your 1 rep max for anywhere from 30 to 40 reps, and then resting for 30 seconds to a minute, and then repeating for as many as you can, resting, repeating. Is that something that you would recommend doing, or do you have other protocols you would follow on, you mentioned an off day. I also don't, that makes total sense to me to do it on an off day too. But what are your maybe top 2 prescriptions for recovery or hypertrophy and power?
So, the reason why there's a standardized kind of prescription where there's 4 sets. The first set is about 30 reps, where you're essentially getting out of the Krebs cycle. That's what the first 30 sets or working to failure does. It immediately puts the muscle into a state where, in order to complete any other activity, the activity is going to be done through what we call the Cori cycle. That's the fast twitch muscle fiber energy system that creates the byproduct of lactic acid. The following 3 sets of 15 on average, which is prescribed, so it'll go 30, 15, 15, 15, with about a 30-second break in between. That's a general prescription for strength and power and for hypertrophy, so you kind of bundle all those into together. Right. And the reason why that's done is there was some recent literature that came out establishing that for muscle hypertrophy, anywhere from like 72 to 75 repetitions is what's required on that muscle group. Well, if you add up 30, 15, 15, 15, you get your nice key number right there. So that's in large part, that's predominantly the prescription that's used for isolation work. And as well for compound work. The only thing you don't do with BFR is plyometrics.
Right.
But some other prescriptions that can be done are things like sled pulls, sled drags. A lot of times I'll set up my clients or patients with their BFR, the Delphi computer system, which is the actual tourniquet system that you guys will see later on. And they'll have it with them. And the benefit of using a computer system like we spoke about before is that it actually monitors their blood flow throughout the entire session. So while they're doing their strength programming, their hypertrophy, or sled drags, sled pulls, they're never going above or below that target zone that they need. And that's the importance of having something that can monitor blood flow and limb occlusion pressure. If I was to provide a prescription for endurance, because there's a lot of information about that out there now, we're looking at essentially 15-minute bouts of about 40 to 45% of a VO2 max. So you could set up somebody with a heart rate monitor if you needed to. And you would essentially up the intensity until they get to that target range, which means they might be doing a pretty slow kind of push, on that bike or push on that recumbent stepper or even on a stepper. I put some people on that before. And you're just monitoring their heart rate, and they're there for 15 minutes. They're getting the same training effects as if they were, at 45 minutes for 80% of their VO2 max, which is really freaking hard to get to. Right. So those are kind of the 2 top condition prescriptions that I use. There was actually a recent, you might guys find this interesting before we run out of time. There was a recent study. It's going to be published. I can send you guys the actual article where they looked at BFR with a paramilitary group. So this was I believe it was an elite group of PJs, so pararescue jumpers, who are very well conditioned. and they had them simply do a walking setup. So much like the bicycle setup, 15 minutes at a low intensity. They simply just had them walk on a treadmill at a grade that increased 1%, 2%, 3%, 3 days a week. And so these guys are already conditioned. So you would say, hey, if you're really conditioned, how do I get you stronger? Programming, not putting weight on the bar first. It's programming, right? It's diet, sleep, stress management, all that stuff. These guys improved in their 1 mile run time, increased in their muscle hypertrophy, strength, and in their time to fatigue simply by just walking. And that was great because that showed that even at a high level of training, these guys were still getting a good effect without having to do any other additional stuff to their program. So BFR really does open the door to various other methods of actually prescribing it. I do a lot of it with my Medicare group. So these are people who are like in a wellness program. I'll use BFR on them because there's very low risk, like I said, of DVTs. Really, the only risks with BFR kind of come with your general weight training risks to begin with: pregnancy, cancer. If there's any sort of very compromised peripheral vascular system. But the cool thing is that because of the low effects that BFR has on blood pressure in general, meaning when Chris is lifting 900 pounds off the ground, his blood pressure is probably up as high as like 500 millimeters of mercury. So it goes up there. His body can handle that. So can anybody else's if you train it enough. BFR levels are super low compared to heavyweight training. So for the elderly population, it's totally safe to use in terms of you're not stressing out their arterial system. Heavyweight training in elderly people shows that it increases arterial stiffness. It doesn't show that with BFR. So the prescriptive mechanisms that I use are just those. My standard 4 sets if it's isolation or compound lift. If it's endurance, I'll use something like that, but I can have them draw out their endurance to something like a sled drag, sled pull. You can, again, on a treadmill or on a bike or on a recumbent stepper or stepper. There's some groups that are even now using it with, you guys ever heard of an Ultra G? Those are 0G treadmills that lower your body weight, let you run at lower weight.
Yeah, we don't have any treadmills in this facility.
But
Yeah.
I think I'm going to have to
cardio's overrated.
cut you off a little bit here, Mario. We're definitely bumping against time.
It's all good, guys. But yeah.
Well,
But I can't believe the amount of knowledge that's happened, and it sounds like we've barely just kind of touched the tip of the iceberg here. So we're going to have you out here at the one, the only Kabuki Strength Lab coming up on June
24th. We decided, yeah.
I thought it was 24th?
June 24th.
Okay, June
24th. Yeah.
June 24th. He's going to be out here doing a clinic on blood flow restriction and certification for those that can and are interested in getting certified. And so please check that out. I'm sure we'll have some links to the sign up by the time that this podcast airs. And where can people find you if they want to find more information about what you're doing as well? Social media, website.
Yeah, so everything is going to be underneath Lifters Clinic. So if you're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, everything is going to be at Lifters Clinic. As well, you can visit liftersclinic.com. From that website is where I post all the seminars that I do with Owens Recovery Science. So you can simply use that link in any of the course codes that are available to actually get signed up. The course codes just allow me to track you specifically so I can email you directly. I'm always taking questions on any social media platform, and as well, locally here in Tennessee, I'm the only commercially available PT that actually does BFR. So we gotta kind of step up the game here in Tennessee. If there's any clinicians here in TN listening to this, reach out. We need to set up a course here as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right.
Do we need to throw out a disclaimer here, Mario, for our listeners? We don't want them running out and buying a sphygmomanometer and restricting their
Yes.
their
So,
limbs.
Yes, obviously, if you're going to be doing this, do it correct. I do have a free BFR book that you can download from my website. It's just a standard ebook. So sign up to the mailer list. I do send out regular emails on BFR. kind of keep my audience up to date on current BFR literature and different ways to apply it. We do the same also through Owens Recovery Science, where we have anybody who gets certified belongs to our kind of like in-member group, which gets special access to specific things that are happening in the BFR community and different ways to market it in your general area to kind of, again, make you most successful. But yes, disclaimer, if you guys are going to be using knee wraps, understand that the risk is there, like with anything. I would not be using a standard blood pressure cuff, though there are some companies that are starting to promote that. The evidence supports, especially if you're doing this to somebody else, as a clinician, as a trainer, you need the right tools to get it, done. I'm obviously going to receive a lot of flack from that. So, we live in a very black and white world with literature. Obviously, I straddle the world of anecdote as well, because that's how all this good stuff gets started. But anybody who has any questions, just feel free to reach out, especially if you're really interested in applying this into your training programming. So,
all right, great. Thanks again so much, and looking forward to seeing you here in a couple months.
Awesome, guys. Thank you. Really appreciate being on.
Thanks for your time
today.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, man.